Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thank you for hanging out with me today. Now, if everything went as planned on my calendar, then today's episode is coming out on January 1st, 2025. So if that is the case, then I want to say Happy New Year to you, and I hope that you had a great holiday season, got to spend some time with family, friends, and did some fun stuff, and got to maybe even enjoy some downtime, or maybe even work on some new music, maybe get some cool toys. Either way, just want to say Happy New Year, and this year is definitely going to be a great year for you. I can feel it. All you got to do is just keep focused, use the content that we talk about in this podcast, anything else that I teach in my courses and books and all that stuff. Use that as leverage and encouragement to keep going with your projects. I know that the beginning of a new year is when everyone starts to focus on what are my goals this year? What do I want to achieve? So maybe music is one of those things that you want to accomplish this year. Maybe it's releasing new songs, or maybe an album, or learning new skills. Whatever it is, keep your focus and just dive deep into the stuff and get more experience and practice and learn and push yourself. And if you do that, I can guarantee you that you'll have a successful year. So really looking forward to this new year up ahead. Now, in today's episode, I'm interviewing Mike Marra, who is a mastering engineer who works out of Joao Carvalho Mastering in Toronto. Joao himself was actually on episode 19 of the podcast way back. That's over 200 episodes ago, which is wild. So definitely feel free to listen to that episode, because I think you'll see a lot of similarities in Joao's philosophies and processes as Mike has today. But in this episode, we dive into a lot about Mike's process when it comes to mastering, but specifically we focus a lot on the idea of mastering for emotion and how to actually create more emotion through the settings that you use. So when it comes to things like EQ or compression, it's not just about boosting certain frequency ranges to have more low end or more mid range or top end, that kind of thing. Instead of thinking about it in terms of frequency content, the way that Mike describes it is that we can use these tools to help infuse emotions, and that various frequency ranges aren't just low end or mid range, they're different emotions. And so we get into Mike's philosophies and processes on that, which I think are really interesting. And I think he gives us a cool perspective in terms of how to treat our music to create a response from our listeners, as opposed to thinking about it in super technical terms and trying to get everything technically correct. Because at the end of the day, no one cares about what you did technically, right? Like, no one knows what tools you use, what frequencies you boosted, that kind of thing. It's all about, did they feel something? And so Mike gets into his process here on how he achieves that. Also in this episode, we dive into Mike's process for getting low end right. If you listen to his tracks, they sound really, really good. They've got tons of great low end clarity, and the mixes also feel really wide too. And we dive into Mike's process for how he creates what he calls the V, which is a way of approaching your music from a visual perspective to create clarity, to create size, to create width, and how to treat the low end in your mix. So we dive into that in this episode as well. So with that said, this is a really fun episode, and I think Mike does a good job of describing why he does things the way he does and what his mindset is going into these things too. So let's just jump right into it. Mike Marra, thanks so much for being on the podcast. How's it going, man?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm excited.
Of course. For people who might not know you and your story and who you are, what you do, what kind of projects you're working on these days, can you give us that background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Mike Marra, mastering engineer out of Joao Carvalho Mastering in Toronto, Canada. I've been there at Joa's studio for probably about 13 years now. So I started there in about 2011. Officially. And then 2012 is, it's kind of a gray area, but 2011 is the kind of the year I started, but 2012 is maybe my official debut. So it was an interesting story about how I got there, but I kind of reached out to Joe probably in 2010 and then talked, kind of asked, is there any internship? My journey to mastering has kind of been a little bit, kind of start and stop over the years. But yeah, I got to Joe's place around 2011. Emailed him 1 year before that, and they said, no, there's no internship, there's no positions. And then I was emailing a lot of the big mastering houses in Canada, Lacquer Channel, and I think that's it actually. A year later, I didn't get any responses from the other ones, but Joe was actually the one to respond. A year later, I thought, you know what, I'm going to try again. So I almost a year to the month or to the day, I tried again to all those mastering houses. There was just a few of them. And Joe responded again, and he said, hey, you know what? I'd love to sit down and talk to you. Can you send me a portfolio of what you've done and so on and so forth? So from there, the rest is history. Me and Joa kind of connected, on a deeper level, other than just mastering personally too, as well. So I really felt a deep connection there, and I thought, you know what, this is going to be good. So I kind of accepted it right there, and then the rest is history. My journey to mastering has probably been, a little bit, I'll say, not conventional in the terms of musicality or just music in general. I'm not educated in music. I'm not a trained musician. I played in bands. I played guitar when I was young. I went to university for actually manufacturing engineering. So I actually have an engineering degree. Yeah. And I worked in corporate for a number of years. I still kept in touch with the quote unquote music community. Throughout my teenage years, I was kind of playing in bands. But I always had a kind of like what we talked about earlier is I have a very technical aptitude and mostly for computers. When I was young, my dad had a Commodore 64, if you can remember that back in the 80s. So I gravitated to that very hard. And I was even programming with the Commodore 64 when I was young, probably 5-6 years old. So I had a very good aptitude to computers and kind of the technology of computers. And where I'm going with this is, as I kind of got into my teenage years, and as the digital age of music came more accessible, I became kind of the guy that I was playing with and jamming with and in bands to record people. So from there, I started, recording in the early days of, we were using SonarWorks back in the day, and then that transitioned into Pro Tools and using Logic and things. But I was always the guy that was kind of doing that. So I was a terrible musician, I'll say. And I consider myself still a terrible musician, but I was very good at that technical aspect. So started recording, and then recording became into, hey, can you mix this for me? And I had no idea what mixing was. Back then, there was no YouTube or very sparsely information around that. So trial and error, right? And just working through that. And then it came to a point where one of the bands I was playing with, they actually, we mixed something, and I co-mixed it, I guess you can say. And we actually wanted to take it to mastering. So we took it to a mastering place. And I was living back in, I think it was Vancouver at this time. I was fascinated with the mastering process. And that's where the journey began. So in the, let's say the mid 2000s, that's where I kind of maybe honed in on the mastering process. So I started reading about mastering. I got the Bobcats book, and I read it cover to cover, like probably a zillion times. And then I just started to deep dive into mastering, what it was, all that. I stayed away from the whole YouTube perspective and online stuff. And again, there was very sparse information around that. But I gravitated toward more literature and just listening. So I started to really listen to music differently as well. So that's kind of the journey. It was a bit unorthodox, not your traditional route, but yeah, that's kind of how I landed into mastering. I was really fascinated with it once I instantly got that connection to it when we were just doing some band work.
That's awesome. Yeah, I kind of relate to that as well. Like, I just growing up, I was always like that techie kid. I loved like learning as much as I could about my computer and like how to. I wasn't programming things, but I was definitely learning like some basic kind of code and whatnot, and I just went really nerdy with that. So I definitely can relate to that side of the story, and being that guy in the band who's like learning about the tech just to like help your band and whatever, right? One thing I always love to ask mastering engineers is like, do you think that you needed to go through that journey of learning to mix before you became a mastering engineer, or do you think you could have just started right in mastering?
Yeah, that's a very good question. For me personally, I think individually the answer would change for everybody. But I'll go back to my past again. When I was young, I always knew I listened to music a little bit differently than the average person. I'll kind of call it a spidey sense. I was lucky enough growing up that my parents had a great appreciation for music. They weren't musicians, but my dad and my mom had a deep vinyl collection of every sort, from rock to jazz to soul to whatever. And I always listened to a lot of music. And when I listened, it wasn't really for enjoyment. I knew back then, I was even listening to the technicality. I had no idea what that meant back when I was younger. So to kind of answer your question is, for me, I think I could have jumped into mastering without mixing. Just because of the way I was honing my listening skills throughout my life and the way that I listened to music when I was young, I think I could have jumped into it without kind of having any pre-knowledge of any of the pre-process, any of the pre-production, I guess, music processes in, up front of mastering.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Like, it might be hard to describe, but like, could you describe what it was about that listening process that you think would prepare you for mastering? Because I think, the big thing with mastering is that like you're taking that 1,000-foot view of the track and hearing it as a whole. Whereas like the person who gets into mixing, they're focused so much on like the little micro details of the kick and snare and all these individual elements. But it does, even if you are mixing, you still do have to zoom out. But from a mastering engineer's perspective, you have to just be entirely focused on that and really like understand the balance and stuff like that. So, how can people learn to maybe hear that big picture view a little bit easier? Or what kind of things should they be focusing on?
Yeah, wow, good. Yeah, that's I think that's the $1 million question, right? Yeah, so I think it's tough. I think that's going to be a tough answer for me to kind of answer, but tough question to answer. But it's really, I think it really is about kind of taking, like, these days there's a lot of mix engineers who do mastering. I think the most successful ones can really get out of their head and really transition their mindset to that holistic picture, right? Because again, in mastering, it is that holistic picture, but you are listening for those details and those micro details. So it's kind of a cross between big picture and kind of micro details, where you're listening to the low end and the kick and how it kicks to the balance, right? I think what it is if you're doing mixing and mastering, or you're just doing mastering or whatever that is, you really have to kind of cut yourself and your whole mindset out to say that those are completely two different roles, and you have to kind of cut that out. Take a break from role number one, which is mixing, and really put that mindset of mastering and big picture in. And don't mix while you're mastering, and vice versa, right? And don't master while you mix. It's a tough question to answer of how you listen, because I think everybody's a little bit different. But really, it's to me, it's big picture, listening to a lot of different kinds of music on different systems. Also, too, when I'm in the grocery store, I'm listening to what's going on and how it's hitting. And to me, the way I master is a lot on emotion and feel, not technicality. Something has to connect with the artist and their audience. So I really like to bring an emotional kind of, I'll say, aspect to my mastering. Is what I'm doing going to connect with, for that artist to their audience? If I'm boosting, 3 dB, 4 dB in mastering, I really don't blink an eye, because as long as that connects, then I've kind of done my job. So I think it's more about the listening is more about how does that piece of music, or how does those elements hit you, and what does that do to you emotionally?
Makes sense. So maybe I'll dive a little deeper and push on you a little bit on that. But like the idea of emotional mastering and doing things that are bringing out emotion in the tracks that you're working on, I think this is something that applies whether you're mixing or whether you're mastering as well. But like, we learn about frequencies and we learn about all the tools, EQ, compression, and stuff like that. And there's nothing in there that says, emotion or like anger or happiness, you know what I mean? Like there's no dial on the tools like that, right? So what are some examples of, like, can you give any examples there of like something that you might do that could evoke certain emotions during the mastering process?
I think it's usually around, it's probably going to be, if depending on how, like, again, every track's going to be completely different, but let's take I have a good example. So something that I worked on in the last few months, it was a hip hop track. It was actually a full album. And one of the songs seemed to have a little bit of aggression to it. but the overall tone of the mix didn't bring that out, right? So it's really about understanding that, what that end goal is and trying to bring that out. So if I'm trying to bring out some aggression, depending on, if it's in the vocal or if it's in, just the instrumentation, I'll try to push and pull on certain frequencies. So I kind of picked up on where they left off in the production and where that vision is going to. And you can pick it up through kind of that production, because you can hear that aggression kind of try to come through. So what I was doing in my job was, you know what, I'm going to highlight this a little bit more, so that aggression comes out a little bit further. Maybe, in that instance, maybe I kind of pulled on some, on some mid-range, just to kind of bring out that vocal aggression, kind of some of that tone in the voice that gives a bit of the grit to that vocal. So you kind of get an understanding of, after you master for a particular number of years, you get an understanding of where a mix can go and what the production team was thinking, even without even asking them, right? Sometimes you do get notes, but yeah, I think that's a good example of bringing out that emotion. Is in that track, it was the aggression that needed to be brought out, because that's what I heard in the mix.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me, and I agree with that. It's like you kind of learn to identify, those different frequency areas where, like little details that most people don't care about, like little grit, or, maybe it's like a slight bit of distortion or whatever. Like if you can bring out those things, you're going to highlight more of that emotion. And that makes a lot of sense to me, for sure.
Correct. Yeah. And if smoothness, then you cut out those areas, right? And people always ask, is there a certain frequency that you always go to or you always cut? And my answer in mastering is no. Like, everything is treated as a brand new piece of art. Like, there's no go-tos, really, for me, at least. And I like to treat it that way, because then it becomes really objective to me. I really hear it for the first time, and I'm not focused on trying to really, put a template on or try to do something first. I really kind of sit back and say, okay, well, what is this telling me, and where do I need to take it?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that is the sign of a good mastering engineer or good mixing engineer. It's like you have to treat every project as a new thing, because like the range of the feel for a kick drum is going to vary from song to song, and based on the tuning of their kick drum or whatever drums they use or skins or whatever, like all those little things make a difference. And maybe it's a difference of like 60 hertz versus 63 hertz or something like that, but like that will make a difference, so you have to at least be attentive to those kind of details so that you can get the most out of the track you're working with.
Correct. And I think especially, and I'm maybe biased, but I think especially in mastering, right, where quality is paramount, and where you're the final set of ears, right? And you don't want to ruin a mix if you're not supposed to. and I kind of say that, kind of in air quotes, but you got to be very delicate, because depending on the mix and the production team and how much effort and, whether they love the mix, you really can't put, a quote unquote template on it. It really needs to be kind of reviewed with a fresh set of ears and a fresh perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So then when you start a project, like what's your typical process there? Or like, how do you go into a new project? What kind of things are you doing as your first steps?
Firstly is obviously getting the track, putting it into the DAW, and just listening. Within the first, 5 seconds, I already know where to take it. You do this enough times, you get an innate sense of where to go. Obviously, sometimes there's notes and, some production notes from the team. Most of the time, not anymore these days, but you instantly get a kind of a feel for what needs to be done. It's kind of listening, and I kind of spot listen first. I listen right at the beginning, right when, there's some type of drop or, chorus, if it's a pop thing, I kind of listen sporadically in different points of the song, and then I'll kind of run through the whole song. My process slightly changes if it's a, single versus a album EP type of thing. And I can describe that, afterwards as well. But let's just call it, if it's a single, I'll kind of spot check it first, go through the whole song. And then, I'll kind of start to put the level up. So I'll drive it into some type of limiting chain. That's the first thing I do. The reason I do that is because I don't start to play with EQ or anything in between is if I start to limit after I've done all my EQ, I have to go back and re-EQ everything because the limiters change something. Every limiter sounds different, does something different. So first thing I do is get it up to level and then process, EQ wise or whatever that may be, corrective EQ, enhancement EQ, whatever needs to be done. So first thing is level up and then go into, kind of I'll say the processing aspect to try to either, balance things if it's imbalanced or sweeten things if it needs to be sweetened, highlight, whatever that may be. If it's an album or EP, usually sometimes I get some notes saying, hey, this is the lead single, or, then I'll kind of listen to that one first and kind of just get a feel for, what that's bringing, and then go through, I'll spot check the album, track to track and kind of listen sporadically to some of the, more key points of that particular track. And if there's, sometimes I get notes too is, hey, this is the best mixed track on the album. So not necessarily the lead single, but they feel it's the best production, best mix. So I'll go to that and use that as a reference, or I'll choose the best mix if I have no notes, right? So depending on if it's a single or album, the process changes slightly.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in those cases where you have the best mix song on it, hopefully the other songs that aren't as good are close, relatively close. But if they're not, like, how do you go about approaching that? Because, you could either try to enhance everything to get it up to that highest level of quality, or maybe you have to go the opposite way to make everything a little bit more consistent, right? And I would think that you probably go in the direction of trying to make everything closer to the best mix, obviously. But yeah, I'm sure that could be a challenge there too, because you probably have to assess, why is this the best mix? And, in those cases, like, do you find that you ever have to go back to the artist and say, like, well, this is why it's the best mix. Can we go back to the mix and, update these things? Or what's your approach in those kind of situations?
Yeah, for sure. And it gets challenging when you have different mix engineers and different production teams across the album, right? Then it becomes even more challenging because now you have mixes in one direction and mixes in another, all put together. And again, most of the time when it's that type of scenario, things are usually somewhat close. But yeah, if it is, if that's the best mix and the rest of the album, or, a majority of the album is not mixed very well, I'll try my thing first. First thing is I always like to try to get it, because my point of view is they signed off on this full album. So my thinking is they like what they've done, right? So I try to go in first and use that, okay, best mix, and let me see if I can get everything close. And if I can't, maybe you're probably right. I would go back and say, hey, like, is this for mixes, tracks, whatever, numbers X, Y, and Z? Is it intended to be that way? Like, I kind of try to bring, that type of question in a very political way. Is it intended to be that way? And if they say yes, then I say, okay, well, then that's the way it's supposed to be. So I'm not going to try to make song 1 like the best mix of song 4. I'm going to treat it the way it is and bring it, bring some level of consistency across the album. But if it's intended to be that way, I'm kind of going to leave it in that type of direction. So yeah, I will reach out if it's very drastic. If it's very minor, then I can get it to kind of balance between, song to song between the album. But sometimes that's just the way that they want it. And they're like, no, that's intentional.
Yeah. It's always interesting whenever it comes to albums, because you could treat each song as individual, or you could treat it as like, we need to get a consistency and frequencies and volumes and whatever. So I feel like that gets harder and harder these days, especially when people are releasing one song at a time and releasing a whole bunch of singles, and then at the end they decide that they're going to throw it all together and make a record out of it. Because then you end up with all these like pre-mastered songs, and they're all different levels and different mixers and whatever. So it can definitely get pretty complicated there.
That happens all the time, where they finally have enough to put an EP, and they're like, they were given up singles, and you mastered them as singles, and then it's like, okay, we want to put these as an EP. Can you balance them? And I'm like, oh man. So now you have to go in and you have to actually redo the mastering. At some points, you even have to just completely redo it and not refer to your back notes. Like, it's, so in some cases it's a complete redo. Now, when you hear the previous master in the final, to, to the average Joe, they're not going to know too much difference. Me and you will notice a lot of difference, right? But yeah, and in some cases that has happened where I've had to go in and just completely reapproach it because they want to put, 4 songs together that were really never made to be together.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing for people to hear about, like that they do have to reconsider how it all comes together when it is an album, because our job as mastering engineers is to make everything have that consistency and flow from one song to the next and tell that story from beginning to end of an album. But yeah, if you have everything all disjointed, then it's going to get distracting. And I think it does emphasize the fact that mastering isn't always just there's not just one way of mastering something, it's not like you just master a song and that's the only version it can be. It's like, how does it fit with everything else? Maybe it does have to change. Maybe the only change is dropping a little bit of low end on it to make it match with the rest of it. It doesn't have to be drastically different, but there still needs to be something done to make this cohesiveness between tracks on a record.
Correct. Yeah. And sometimes mastering is just doing nothing. Hardly anything, and just kind of, maybe a tweak here, a tweak there, or in some cases, sometimes just putting a limiter on it. We're really consultants at the end of the day and just saying, hey, this is a mix. What do you think? And, is it ready for prime time? Is it ready for distribution? And in some cases, I've had projects where it's, an EQ and limiter, and the EQ is doing no more than 2 bands at, no more than half a dB, and that's it. And it's a limiter, and it's gone. I think a lot of people think mastering is, a lot of correction, a lot of saturation, color, and, putting, loudness obviously is there, but I think great mastering comes from a great mix and production. And great mastering comes with hardly doing much at all. Just tweaking things, kind of left and right, and pushing and pulling on things.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked about limiting and how that's kind of the first stage in your processing chain, just to get everything up to level and so you can hear everything the way it's going to be at the final level. What typically would come next in your chain?
After limiting, I'll go to kind of the balance perspective. Is everything in balance EQ wise? So is everything in balance? Do I need to EQ something? Do I need to kind of pull some low end, or maybe compress some low end? Maybe use a multiband if the low end's really out of cohesion. I'll kind of go to those types of corrective processes, whether it's EQ or very selective, multiband type of compression. I don't use a lot of multiband unless the mix is completely out of balance. But yeah, it's usually correction EQ. If there's any, I'll call it the correction process, any de-essing, any correction EQ, any correction compression that needs to be done. Once that's addressed, then it's basically, I'll say, the sweetening process. So then I'll go into that and, hey, what can, the whole emotion thing, can I bring out more aggression? Can I bring out more? Do I have to soften, a particular vocal to make, a more ambient type of environment, right? So I'll kind of go into that more sweetening, or that more, I'll call it, emotional type of, I call it emotional mastering, that emotional type of mastering to bring, the best out of the track. And really, that's kind of I kind of bucket it into those 3 categories. Is really level up, balance, and sweetening. And sweetening can be saturation, can just be EQ. It could be many things. So I kind of bucket it into those 3 components, and then limiting, is basically limiting. So whether I'm clipping, so clipping, limiting, the whole limiting chain, that's kind of the first thing that I usually address. But yeah. So limiting first, correction, and then sweetening.
That makes sense. As far as that correction phase goes, I imagine as a mastering engineer working on tons of projects, you see a lot of consistencies in the types of problems that get presented to you in that correction stage. What would you say are some of those biggest issues or most common issues that you see in a lot of the projects that you work on, so that people can maybe implement that better into their mixes and ultimately give you better stuff to master?
Yeah. Low end is definitely the biggest one, right? And I kind of have a theory around it. It's not really a theory, but I think the reason why low end is so difficult to get in a production or a mix to get exactly, what you would hear in a commercial track on the radio or on Spotify. I think it comes down to the mix engineer's room, right? It's not the fancy tools. It's not going to be, you're not going to hear me say it's going to be, you need this tool and your low end's going to be phenomenal. I think if you can't hear it, you can't really address what you're really doing. And low end is one of those things where if your room is not optimal to hear low end, you won't be able to mix it right. And then it comes to my stage, and then there's only so much we can do to try to really kind of mold it, right? So low end is usually the biggest issue. I say the second issue is vocal, how do I say, vocal timbre. So interesting enough is the first time I touch a mix, sometimes that mix just falls apart on first touch. And what it is, and then many things start to just kind of pop out. And vocals are the ones that were, if they're not, recorded correctly, they're not mixed, I should say correctly, but maybe the recording is not great. And then it goes into the mix and they only have so much they can do and control. And then that just kind of permeates into my area. And then once you start pushing and pulling on things, then things start to get exposed. Even too, as soon as you drive into some type of limiting chain or final, let's call it final loudest change, things get really exposed, and vocals are one of the ones that get exposed for all the flaws that have happened up front. So that's two areas I really see a lot of common issues with, is low end and just vocal timbre with regards to how it's been treated before me.
Yeah, I love that. I think that it's something that I've been trying to say on this podcast for a long time, which is that like everything starts from the recording stage, and a great master is a result of great recording. So like you have to be focusing on that early stage, because every stage of the process relies on the previous stage to be done to the best of its abilities. And there's only so far you can take something that wasn't recorded at the optimal conditions, So the fact that in mastering, you're noticing recording problems, I think that's really interesting, because, a lot of people would think that mastering is just going to reveal mixing issues, but yeah, recording is definitely a big one that you're seeing there.
Yeah. In vocals, it's probably more recording issues. Maybe the mic wasn't good enough, or whatever that may be, or the position of the vocalist, right? So in the vocal, it's really recording issues. In the low end, it might be, again, a lot of low end these days, depending on if your live band is all kind of sampled, right? So the low end is probably more of, I'll say, a mix issue. It could be a production issue, depending on if you're choosing different beats, or if you're more of an, I'll say, kind of an electronic type of low end. But yeah, low end, maybe I'll contribute more to mixing, and vocal, I'll contribute more to recording.
For sure, but it definitely could be a recording issue, as far as like maybe not even recording, but more like arrangement perspective, and thinking about what's supposed to fill in the low end, as opposed to just like recording it all and then trying to mix that low end later. At least planning stage can be really important for getting that balance, right?
Well, you bring up a good point, because a production and arrangement, it usually drives kind of, I get this question a lot, is, how can I get things loud, right? And I tell them, like, I usually say it really comes from the production side. It doesn't come really from, it doesn't come 100% from the mix, and it doesn't come 100% from the mastering. On the production side, the arrangement kind of dictates really that whole perceived loudness of how the arrangement is flowing and how it hits, right? Arrangement has a big play in the whole aspect of that, I don't know what you would call that, psychoacoustic type of feeling. And maybe that's a natural, an obvious answer, but it really has to me, it has a big part in it.
Yeah, well, of course. I think that it's just like, before you start recording, you have to have that vision of what you want your track to sound like. And once you start tracking, like, it has to be filling that vision. Like if you're recording with like, I don't know, like a Beatle bass, that's not going to necessarily sound as like full as, I don't know, like a jazz bass or something like that. Like there's different types of things that are going to fill in that space. Or, maybe relying on like a synth to give you that low end. Like you have to be thinking ahead of like, what is providing that feel, and am I using the right tools? Am I using the right arrangement, like all that stuff to slot everything in a way that gives you that balanced EQ.
Correct. And I think this is where a good full production team kind of comes in, right? And when I mean production team, it's, it's writers, producers, recording engineers, mix engineers, mastering engineers, all that, right? And I think these days, again, it could be for budget purposes. Production teams aren't really as accessible to certain people as some, right? But I think you get the best out of it when you have different people in a room, like you said, is saying, hey, this is the right avenue to go to, and to help you achieve your vision. It's really a more collaborative type of process that can really get you to your final goal, rather than you sitting in your room thinking about all those aspects like you just mentioned of, what do I do? That's very daunting for somebody to really take on all themselves.
For sure. Yeah. Well, speaking of low end, like one of the things that really stood out to me when I was listening to your portfolio was the low end of the tracks that you master. And, one thing that really stood out to me with regard to the low end was that a lot of the masters you work on, they have this like really cool, clear stereo spread to them. Like everything feels really big and full. And I actually think that a lot of that has to do with the way you treat low end. Because to me, when I listen to the low end of the masters, to me, it felt like your low end, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like I feel like the low end is typically like almost a little bit more narrow in the mix or in the master, which then allows room for everything else to live on the sides and feel wider. And so I'm curious to know, is that something that you're consciously working on as you're mastering your tracks, or is that more of a product of just like how mixes are sent to you and they just happen to be great mixes?
Yeah. No, not every mix is a great mix. I'll kind of be honest, but it depends on the genre, right? So if we're talking pop, right? Pop, needs to be, it needs to breathe in that upper frequency region, and that needs to be, vocals need to be very clear and present. So do I make a conscious effort to really kind of tailor low end in a certain way? It depends on how it comes in. But yes, I will kind of treat that to make sure that particular pop style is coming through. Now, if the mix is coming, with a big 808, big low end, and it's very stereo, I'm not gonna screw too much with that. But if it's more of that quote unquote pop template, I'm going to go in and try to carve that V so that, it is really down the center, and not muddying up a lot of what needs to sparkle, kind of, and move in that other stereo field. If we're talking, hip hop, then, I'll say hip hop, needs to be driven by low end. I don't like cutting any low end. I adverse cutting from any low end, like high passing. I hate high pass. It just robs power from a whole track. But yeah, so especially in hip hop or EDM or any type of, bass heavy music, I really try to, kind of leave that the way it is, and let that be the driving factor. So I'm not going to really carve too much out of that particular aspect, because that is the driving factor. But pop is usually one where you get kind of that V, where the low end needs to be tight and really centered so that everything breathes across the top.
Yeah, I think the V is a great way of visualizing what I was talking about, because everything is very focused in that center point, and then everything else is all like side information and that width. So that's very cool that you look at it that way.
Yeah, and then hip hop is more like it's not V'd, it's kind of a little bit like that, and then rock is probably like there's low end and guitars going on left and right and stereo, so it's a little bit there. And two, I can't take credit for that particular V. There's a mastering engineer. Oh my God, I'm gonna forget his name. Brian Lucy out of LA, Garden Mastering, Magic. Yeah. I can't remember. You know what I'm talking about.
Mystical Garden Mastering, I think.
Yes, something.
I was literally watching something about him yesterday night. So I don't know why I'm forgetting the name either, but yeah.
Yeah, I can't take credit because he, years ago, he explained low end like that as well. And I thought, that's it. That's exactly it. Obviously, pop has changed too, right? Because we're getting a lot of 808s and panned low end that's coming in. The Weeknd's a great example of that, where the low end is really kind of, it's still there in the middle, but there is a lot of, I'll call it side information or stereo information when it comes to lows, right? So low end has changed over the years to morph into different aspects. And two, I think we saw a trend in low end where there was a lot of stereo information in low end. So if you were to go online and you kind of look up all those, oh, you have to high pass the sides, right? With, at 100 hertz. And to me, I cringe when I hear that, because I'm like, oh my God, you're robbing so much of that power out of the production there when you do have that stereo low end. So it's just interesting.
Yeah. So then that kind of ties to another question I had for you is in regards to creating that V with the low end, are you relying a lot on mid-side processing to do that? Or is it just like, how are you getting that V or shaping it into that V?
I try to not use as much mid-side, because when I go into mid-side, I find it just doesn't sound natural. Maybe there's phase issues that kind of get introduced once you go into mid-side. So I try to keep it as natural as possible, going into EQ in a stereo perspective. And just, let's put it this way, I really have an affinity to low end, and kind of, again, maybe that spidey sense to low end. And I really focus on it. And I really try to make it, that I don't want to say my staple, but I'll say maybe it is my staple. Maybe I just hear it a little bit differently, and I try to bring it out and really tighten things where it needs to be tightened. And if it means going into mid-side, then I will. But I don't think I particularly have a particular process to kind of get that shape, kind of there. It really is a little bit of trial and error, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. So as far as I know, a lot of people listening to this aren't necessarily mastering engineers. Maybe they want to get into it, but even from a mixing perspective, like, to help people get that V, because I do think that, like, that when I start to really visualize it and focus on it, like, I realize to myself, like, that's just like what I always want. Like, I love a master that just has that big spread, and it still feels full. It doesn't feel like everything is lacking on the sides or anything like that, but like, it still has the energy. It has that emotional response and everything you just talked about. You also kind of mentioned, like, staying away from high pass filters. And I think high pass filters is one of those things that early on, a lot of mixers learn, like, high pass everything except for kick and bass. Like, do you agree with that? Or, like, as far as, like, how far people should go with high passes or whether or not they should use them, like, what's your suggestion there?
Definitely up until mastering, high passes are probably, are a tool to be used, because you have to cut away. If you're working on a mix and you're working with elements, you have to make space in a mix, right? So high passing is definitely a tool that is used at the mixing stage to, cut out low end that doesn't need to be there for particular elements, whether it be vocal, kick, whatever that may be, so that when you are mixing, you have space, that your arrangement or the mix has space for elements to breathe. When it comes to mastering, I think high pass is used, to me, as a last resort. Because, like I said earlier, is when I high pass something, when you listen, the power of that track is completely robbed, and it's very noticeable to me. It's like that drive, because I have an affinity to low end, that whole drive is gone, and then I find if I do that, I have to make up that particular drive somewhere else. So that's why over the years, I used to high pass stuff, because I got into the whole I guess notion of listen, you hear it on YouTube, oh, high pass everything, and you'll get nice big wide masters, and it's true, you will get a nice upper area, I'll say, cleanup, but when you really listen, what you're losing is a lot of that power. And sometimes, and especially in a lot of the music I work on, which is either EDM, hip hop, a lot of really low end driven music, that is crucial for that final state, right? So I'm really conscious about that when I high pass stuff, and I think, is the power robbed from this track? And am I doing good or just more harm at the end of the day? But definitely up front, I think in pre-mastering, high passes are a tool to be used.
For sure. Yeah, and I think also with mastering, it's like you're getting someone's mix a way that they like. So if you're robbing it of that low end that they put in there, maybe you're going against what they had in mind. And maybe to your earlier point, maybe they just don't have a great room to actually accurately monitor that stuff and they can't hear the problems. But at the same time too, like you don't want to start thinning something out that maybe they intended it to have a lot of low end and feel full and energetic, right? I've always heard the argument that I've always heard for it as far as mastering goes is like, if you trim a little bit of the low end, then you give yourself more headroom, and then maybe you can make louder masters or whatever. But I do agree with you there that like then you start losing the energy of the track. So it's kind of prioritizing like what's more important, the volume or the feel of the track. And I think most people would say the feel, right?
It's kind of a misnomer. Yes, you do get a bit of RMS headroom, but you actually increase your peak headroom when you high pass. So try this next time you're mastering. High pass something and check what your peak levels are at, like your peaks. They actually, what you actually introduce is actually more peak. So basically, you're limiting or clipping more now because you've introduced a high pass. So you're actually introducing more peak level. Yes, you gain more RMS, but you're actually introducing more peak level, which in some cases is not ideal.
And why would that be? Is it just because you're then making it thinner, which is making it focus more on the transient information as opposed to the more average level? Is that the argument for it?
Yeah, I think there's some type of, I don't know technically what the word is. I don't want to call it aliasing or when you high pass something, it's almost like you unglue something that's happening in the upper areas. When you high pass something, you'll notice that if your peak level before high passing was, let's call it 3 dB, you'll be going over. You'll add another dB or 2 dB when you high pass something instantly. It's I don't know technically what's going on, like how to explain it, but you'll see it right away. And then what happens is then you have to control those peaks through limiting or compression or just limit or clipping. Then you're introducing distortion. So you're kind of even doing more damage by high passing than kind of addressing that low end issue in a different way. It's interesting. I learned that early on that you actually introduce more peak level when you're high passing.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see where you're going with that, and it does definitely make sense that like if you then have to go down the chain and start adding more processing, then you're just working against yourself there for sure.
Yeah. And too, as mastering, you don't want to. You try to keep it, kind of cliche for me to use, but you kind of want to keep it as minimal and clean as possible. But again, I do use high pass when it's extremely necessary, but I try to avoid it and process things in a different way rather than using it.
Yeah. So then, because you said that low end is kind of like the thing that you love to just really focus on, what are some areas of the low end that people should be paying attention to? Like, are there certain frequency ranges that you're typically listening for, certain characteristics of sound, or like, how do you listen to low end to make sure you're getting it right?
Again, this is going to be cliche, but it comes down to just experience, right? Just listening to a lot of different things and not just, low end heavy music, even rock or jazz. You listen to the way the low end is hitting, and you kind of get a sonic imprint of that. One common thing that I kind of see in low end, and this is from a mastering perspective, is I kind of see, kind of get technical in a hertz, in a kind of a frequency perspective, kind of that in that 70 to 80 hertz range. Sometimes you get a lot of buildup in that range, and I think it's a symptom of the room, not hearing it, but I do hear kind of common issues in that kind of that 70 to 80 hertz range, where it's maybe a little bit bloated. And that's where you kind of cut a little bit away, and then it kind of just, kind of separates a little bit and kind of tightens up. Other than that, it's really goes back to the production. And did you choose the right, again, if it's more of a sample type of low end, did you choose the right low end? Did you process it correctly? Can you hear what it's doing, right? Can you hear the sub of it, right? Because if you can't hear it, you can't treat it. Can you hear everything, perfectly? And two, even if your room is not completely tuned, is your sonic imprint of low end, can you work on something and make it translate? Do you have enough, I'll say, kind of your sonic catalog to kind of figure out how to treat it in your environment so that it translates to a mix properly, right? Referencing it on different system is definitely, a key for mix engineers. But yeah, I think technically, if I really go right down to a frequency perspective in that 70, 80, 90 hertz range, that's where I see a lot of kind of more of that booming, like kind of something not clear there. Something's not, something's muddying, I should say muddying it up, but just not clear, not giving enough love to the low end, and maybe it just needs to be cut away a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. That's something that I see with a lot of the tracks that I master. It's like, I think a lot of people still have this association of like kick and bass need to live below 100 hertz. And so they just boost everything below 100 hertz. And then that's where you're getting all that mud, is that like you haven't created any separation between those two layers. So because of that, it is just this blurry sound, and there isn't a very definitive like kick energy spot and like bass clarity. Like you have to create those pockets for each other to make it work well. And yeah, there's only so far you can take it, I guess, in mastering once you have all that mud in there, right?
Exactly. Because once you start pulling, a little bit of that lower end, then things start to pop out in the upper end. So, I just recently saw something online that somebody said, oh, you should always cut, I can't remember what the frequency range is, 120 or 150 hertz. And I'm like, if you do that, you start cutting, what you'll notice is that the vocal just gets unglued and starts coming up because now you're cutting away the body of some of the vocal in that range. So it's mastering's a completely different mindset, where you really have to, again, back to the big picture, is you really have to listen, because you're doing something here. You have to step back and listen again. Is what I'm doing affecting anything else, right? And I'm not saying mixing doesn't have that, but really, a mastering perspective with, a stereo mix, 2 channels, you really have to be delicate to what you're doing and really have that vision of full picture.
Of course, yeah. And just to your point there, or to your comment about seeing YouTube videos where people say you should always cut something. Anytime someone says you should always do something, that is a very clear sign to just click away from whatever you're watching. It is not going to be accurate.
Yeah. I advise people to stay away from any type of YouTube tutorials. There are a few good ones out there, but stay away from any mastering YouTube tutorials. They're not doing you any justice. Just sit down, listen to music, get your, hone your listening skills, understand how EQ works, how limiting works, and I think you'd be way better off.
Yeah, fair. I think that it's safe to say, yes, there are certain characteristics of sounds that you will find in certain frequency ranges, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you always need to be boosting or always need to be cutting, or by however many dB or whatever it is. Like, there's no one way to do everything. And so for anyone to say like you should always do that, it's usually a pretty good indication it's wrong. So
yeah, just like you should always high pass in mastering. And I'm like, oh.
Exactly, right? There we go. Well, I think we've already dispelled like a lot of myths about mixing and mastering in this episode already, which is great.
Yeah. I like to keep it as real as possible.
Yeah, for sure. So then, like, at the end of the day, then like, how do you know when you're ultimately done with a master? Like, how do you know when it's ready to go?
I think as a person, mastering engineer is kind of, I don't want to say, I don't particularly have OCD, but to me, it's never done. There's always a rabbit hole that I can kind of dive into. But I will say is, again, back to that particular emotional connection. To me, it's done when I feel that. So there's many times, you go in and even, maybe a project that I did recently, the mix was good. It just needed a little bit of, kind of just sprucing up to kind of get it popping. But it really spoke to me once I did it. It really connected with me. And I think at that point, I'm kind of like, I'm done. I'm not going to touch it anymore. Once it connects with me and I kind of, hear it and I kind of go, that feels good. Like, to me, it's done. So I try not to touch it after that and get down rabbit holes, because, I could start to go down and say, I can actually get the low end tighter or bigger or whatever. And then, and then I'm just there for another, 2 hours. Right. So yeah. Again, back to the emotional perspective, it really has to connect with me. And that happens all the time. I do connect with every piece that I get. And once I feel that connection, it's like, yes, okay, it's done. Let's close the session, save it, send it out. It's done.
But that's a good way to look at it, because I think that, like, I can master something today and feel great about it today. tomorrow I can listen to it and have a different thought. Like every day is going to feel something different, and you can master the same song 5 different days and it's going to sound different all those days. So you can't focus necessarily on doing everything technically a certain way and having a technical goal in mind there. It's just about that emotional thing that's going to make you realize you like it or not, right?
Correct. And especially with the deadlines that are there, you really don't have time to rethink it. And two, you don't want time to rethink it, because once you have that connection, and as a mastering engineer, if you've done enough work, you should have that intuition to know how it's going to be perceived, right? So you have that sonic imprint, that sonic catalog in your head, and you can kind of draw on it from that perspective. So I think it's a good thing not to overthink it as a mastering engineer. And once you have that this is it, close it, send it, because deadlines, are very quick these days. The turnaround's very quick. So you just don't have time to rethink it. And two, when you do have time to rethink it, then like you said, you're going in a million times and changing it, and then you just end up back at your original master that you internally approved, right? So it's interesting.
But I do think that emotional response is like the best barometer for sure. And I think it's the reason why, like, if in mixing people focus on being 100% technically accurate and having everything perfect, if you were just 100% focused on that, you would probably never go to mastering, because you would have mastered it yourself or whatever, it'd be like all the highest levels and everything ready to go. But it's like a mixer does their job to a point where they feel that they emotionally resonate with it. It feels good to them and they're ready to ship it off. And then they're waiting for someone else to like offer their perspective in mastering to like maybe bring up the levels and clean it up a little bit. But it's like having that third party emotional response to it to add to it and to sweeten things, right? It's interesting to know, like, to see how much of the process relies on that emotional response and making sure that all along the way it's matching throughout the process.
Yeah, I think that's why we all listen to music, right? Is for that type of connection, right? And that emotional, that emotional response, right? Without that, I don't know what music would be, right? And I think too is I think we've gone away, I think I say we in the collective, we've gone away from that type of emotional response for some period of time, where everything needed to be technically clean and accurate, right? And that just sounded too cold and too just manufactured and not authentic. I do believe we're going back to kind of that more let's say emotional type of productions, or let's say creation of productions or injection of that. But I do think there was a period of time where everything needed to be very, very technically clean. And I do think that things are changing now as well.
Yeah. Well, music has always been a cyclical thing, right? It's like we might go through a phase where everything is really clean, and then you're going to get that band that like that Nirvana or whatever that like sounds totally different, and then everyone's like, okay, that's the coolest new thing, like that evoked an emotion, so let's dig into that a little bit more. And then you're going to go through a phase where everything's dirty and grimy and whatnot, and then it's going to start to go clean again, and it's always cyclical. So it's kind of just keeping up with whatever's happening, and again, whatever's creating that emotional response. Maybe you want that clean sound when everything else is dirty right now, or the opposite, right? So
correct. Yeah, exactly. It's all kind of keeping up with the times and the trends and what needs to be, what again, just serving the vision of the artist and the production team at the end of the day in a mastering perspective. It's whatever is their vision. That's what my goal is.
Yeah, of course. I love that, man. Well, I think this is probably a good spot to start to wrap things up. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can catch me online just on my website, MikeMarra.com, MikeMarraMastering.com, or on Instagram at Mastered by Mike Marra. Usually I'm pretty active on Instagram, DMing, so you can always reach out for me there, or just through my email.
Love it, man. Well, Mike, thank you again for coming on here. And I think you gave us a lot of like really cool perspective on what to be listening for. And I know I pushed you on some questions that like, about how you're listening, but I think that that's all stuff that is important for people to kind of start to make those connections between like what their EQ is doing versus that emotional response and how they're related. And it isn't just about the lyrical content or whatever. It's like the stuff that we're doing on the technical side does impact that emotional connection. So yeah, I think it's a really cool perspective that you bring, and I thought you brought some really cool examples there about how to achieve that. So thank you again for coming on.
No, thank you, Mike. It was a pleasure. I love this stuff. I love talking about it, and anytime, I love it.
Right on, man. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mike.
So that was my episode with Mike Marra, and I thought that the conversation around mastering for emotion was a really helpful one to have. And I think that it offers a fresh take on how to approach your music, whether you're mixing or you're mastering. And I like that he was able to articulate what that process actually looks like, because sometimes it can be hard to describe what we're listening for when we're talking about emotions, right? So I kind of pushed him on some of the answers that he had, but I thought that in the end, he did a great job of explaining how when you boost certain frequencies, you might get more aggression out of a vocal or stuff like that. And again, I think that that is a cool way of thinking about EQ instead of just focusing specifically on vague terms like low end or top end or whatever. You know, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what is the content in those frequency ranges? What does that sound like? And when we understand that, when we can start to associate those frequency ranges with emotions and feelings, then we can start to make our music more exciting. So I thought that was a really cool thing to dive into in his process. And again, I thought he did a great job of explaining how we can pull some of that emotion out of our tracks by using the tools instead of just trying to focus on it being technically a certain way, right? So yeah, I really enjoyed that. I also thought it was fun to dive into his process about low end and creating the V, you know, and what that looks like. And if you can't understand what that sounds like, I would highly suggest that you go to his website, listen to his portfolio, because then you'll hear it. You'll hear how his tracks have that V where there's a lot of focus in the center of a track, but then on the sides, you can hear the clarity and the width, but in a way where everything has its own separation. And I think that largely has to do with the way he's handling his low end and creating that V in his tracks. And lastly, I really appreciated how he focused on how mastering doesn't just radically transform a mix or a track in general. It all starts with a great recording. And I thought it was interesting to hear him talk about how, in addition to low end being a major problem that he hears, a lot of the times the biggest problems aren't to do with the mixes, they're to do with the recordings. And I think that is a really important thing for people to pick up on, because it's so easy to want to rush through the process to get an idea recorded. And then people think, well, I could just fix that in the mix, or I could fix it in mastering. But as Mike talked about here, if you're not really focused on getting the perfect source tracks and proper takes and proper mic technique and choosing all the right equipment and positions and all that kind of stuff to get something sounding great at the source, even with great mixing, even with great mastering, it's still never going to meet its full potential. So I appreciate that he focused on that, because it's a good reminder to us that we have to take our time throughout this. And as much as we just want to work fast and get stuff done, we can't rely on it getting fixed later on in the chain. It has to start sounding great at the source. So that is a really important thing to focus on. Now, with that said, if you do feel like your tracks are never quite reaching their full potential, even though you've spent a lot of time learning about mixing or maybe even mastering, and you're still not quite getting things right, chances are that maybe you're missing out on something in the recording stage. Or maybe you do actually do that properly, but you don't know everything you need to know about the mixing process or editing or that kind of stuff. So either way, if you're not getting the fullest potential out of your tracks and you want help identifying where the weak links are in your chain and how to do each stage of the production process so that you achieve pro sounding tracks that compete with your favorite recordings, then that is exactly what I focus on with my coaching students inside of my program, Amplitude. In that program, I walk you through a beginning to end system that is repeatable so that you know exactly what to do during the recording, editing, and mixing processes. You get your tracks mastered, and in the end, you end up with a system that you can use on all of your songs moving forward that gets you that high quality, and you end up with songs that are ready for release and that finally sound the way you've always heard them in your head. So if you're interested in learning more about that program and getting one-on-one help and support and feedback on your tracks, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and that is where I have all the information about my coaching program there. And I'd love to hop on a call with you. I'd love to learn more about what you're working on, what your goals are, and how to best help you. And if it seems like I can help you, then we'll talk about the program and what it looks like to work inside. I only take on people who I truly believe I can help. So if you're interested in learning more, again, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude and make sure to fill out the application form on there and book a call with me. And then we can see if I can help you. So with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.